He had written the notice himself twice because the first draft hadn't seemed firm enough, and nailed it to the post office board in Sparrow Creek where every widow and spinster in the county would be sure to see it. Housekeeper wanted. Steady work, fair wages, no children. He had underlined the last two words so hard the pencil had nearly torn through the paper, and he did not regret it, not with the ranch house standing empty and silent the way it had stood since the fever took his wife and the son she'd been carrying, 3 winters back. He had no room left in him for small voices and smaller footsteps. He wanted a woman who could cook and mend and keep the house from falling into ruin around him, nothing more. Grady Fenn was still turning that thought over 3 days later when a wagon rattled up his drive with a woman on the bench seat, straight-backed and pale, a battered trunk behind her, and tucked beside it, a large covered laundry basket she held onto with both hands like it held something breakable. "Mrs. Naomi Wren," she said, climbing down before he could offer a hand, "answering your notice." She was younger than he'd expected, and thinner, with the kind of tired eyes that told a man a woman had buried someone recently and hadn't finished grieving so much as run out of time to. He looked at her, and then at the basket she would not set down. "Linens," she said before he asked. "I didn't want them creased in the trunk." It was a strange enough answer that he might have pressed her on it, but the wind was picking up and the sky to the west had gone the color of a bruise, and a man learned in this country not to waste daylight arguing over trifles. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said instead. "You'll find the stove temperamental and the well rope frayed. I expect supper by 6 and I don't tolerate foolishness." "I don't traffic in foolishness, Mr. Fenn," she said, gathering the basket against her chest, and something in the careful way she said it, the way her arms curved protectively around the covered wicker, should have told him more than it did. But he was a man who had trained himself these 3 years not to look too closely at things that might ask something of his heart, and so he turned and went to see to his horses, and did not think to wonder why a basket of linens needed holding so gently, or why, an hour later, he thought he heard through the kitchen wall a sound almost like a thin, hiccuping cry, quickly, urgently hushed. Naomi had known the risk the moment she'd read his notice in the depot window, the ink still fresh, no children scrawled beneath the wage like a wall built specifically to keep her out. She had stood there with baby Grace asleep against her shoulder, 4 months old and already an orphan twice over, first her father, dead of a fall from a green horse before she was born. Then, a bare 6 weeks past, Naomi's own sister, who died bringing her into the world and left Naomi the only kin the child had left on this earth. She had no money, no husband, no family willing to take in a widow and a stranger's infant both. She had exactly one skill the world seemed to want, which was a strong back and steady hands, and exactly one chance, which was a hard rancher's notice with 2 ugly words underlined on it. So she had lied. She had told herself it was not truly a lie, only an omission, only a thing she would explain the moment she'd proven her worth enough that the truth couldn't undo it. She had packed Grace into the bottom of the laundry basket, nestled deep in flannel and hushed with a sugar teat, and prayed the whole rattling ride out from town that the baby would sleep, and go on sleeping, until Naomi could find some safe hour to explain herself. That first week, she managed it through sheer nerve and less sleep than she'd thought a body could survive on. She fed Grace before dawn and after dark, in the locked privacy of her little room off the kitchen, and carried her, silent and swaddled tight, out to the root cellar during the 2 hours after supper when Grady rode the fence line and would not think to look for his housekeeper there. She scrubbed his floors and mended his shirts and cooked meals so good he began, grudgingly, to compliment them. And every night she lay awake with Grace curled against her, listening for footsteps, terrified of the day her secret would end everything. It was Grady who nearly found them out on the 9th night, when he came back early from the fence line with a torn hand that needed binding and found the kitchen empty, and a strange muffled sound coming from beneath the cellar door. "Mrs. Wren," he'd knocked, and the sound had stopped dead, and when she'd come up a moment later, flushed and breathless, claiming she'd been chasing a rat from the potato bin. He had believed her mostly because a man does not expect to find an infant in a cellar and so does not look for one, even when the evidence is standing before him with her collar buttoned crooked and her arms empty in a way that seemed, faintly, wrong. He bound his own hand badly that night, refusing her help, and lay awake himself wondering why his new housekeeper flinched at every small sound and vanished for an hour every evening like a woman keeping an appointment with a ghost. He did not have long to wonder. 2 weeks in, a hard spring storm blew down out of the mountains faster than either of them had watched for, and Grady came in soaked to the skin at full dark to find the whole house dim and Naomi standing rigid in the kitchen doorway. And behind her, unmistakable now, rising thin and furious over the drumming rain on the roof, the unmuffled cry of a baby who had worked its blanket loose and would not be hushed by any amount of desperate rocking. For one terrible moment neither of them moved. Naomi's face had gone the color of the storm outside, and Grady stood dripping in his own doorway with his jaw set hard, and the baby went on crying, small and outraged and entirely, undeniably real. "You lied to me," he said low, and it was not a question. "I did." She did not look away from him, though her arms had gone instinctively toward the sound, toward the child she could not yet go comfort with him standing there like judgment itself. "I lied because the truth would have left us both in that storm outside your door instead of in it. My sister died 4 months past and left me her daughter, and I had no one, Mr. Fenn, no money and no kin willing to take a stranger's baby and a widow both, and your notice was the only door in this county still open to me. I am not sorry I lied to get through it. I am only sorry for what it has cost you to trust me and be wrong. I told you no children." His voice was rough, and beneath the roughness something else was moving that he did not yet have a name for. "I told you plain." "You did." Her chin lifted, even with her heart breaking behind it. "And I will pack tonight in this storm if you ask it, rather than beg you for what you already refused once." He should have said yes. Every hard year since his wife's death had built him toward saying yes, toward the safety of an empty house where nothing small and helpless could be lost to him again. But the baby went on crying in the next room, and Naomi stood before him with her spine straight and her eyes wet and refused to beg, and Grady found that the words would not come. "Go to her," he said instead, gruff, looking away first, "before she wakes the whole county." Naomi went, and when she came back with Grace settled at last against her shoulder, small and pink and hiccuping the last of her sobs into silence, she found Grady still standing where she'd left him, staring at the child with an expression she could not read, not anger anymore, but something older and more complicated, grief perhaps, or its ghost, walking back through a door he'd nailed shut 3 years before. "My wife was carrying a son when the fever took them both," he said, quiet to the baby more than to Naomi. "I swore off the sound of children in this house because I could not bear to hear one and think of the one I lost. That's the whole of my ugly little notice, Mrs. Wren, not cruelty, cowardice." "It isn't cowardice to protect a wound," she said softly. "I know that better than most." He looked at the baby a long moment more, and then, slowly, held out one scarred finger, and Grace's small hand closed around it with the blind, absolute trust of the very young, and something in Grady Fenn's chest that had been locked 3 winters tight came open with a suddenness that frightened him. He let them stay. He told himself, the next morning and for several mornings after, that it was only practicality, only that a good housekeeper was hard to find and harder still to replace over a matter already settled. But he found himself listening for the baby's small sounds through the wall the way a man listens for a fire that has finally, blessedly, caught and taken hold. He found himself carving a small wooden ring for Grace's teething, gruffly, refusing to explain why, sanding the edges smooth long after any reasonable man would have called the work finished. He took to bringing in extra wood before Naomi could ask, to mending the cradle-less corner of her room with a shelf for diapers and salves without being told it was needed, small offerings he never called by their true name, which was courtship. Naomi, for her part, stopped flinching at his step on the porch. She found she no longer held her breath when he came in early, no longer rehearsed excuses in the back of her mind for every small sound behind the cellar door. She watched him some evenings, teaching himself patience over a baby who spit up on his good shirt and shrieked at being burped and loved him anyway, without condition, the way only the very small can, and she felt something in her own chest battered by 2 deaths, and a lie she'd had to tell to survive them begin slowly, to trust the ground beneath her feet again. He found himself, 3 weeks later, standing in the kitchen doorway at dusk watching Naomi hum some tuneless lullaby while she stirred the supper pot with the baby balanced on one hip, and understood, with the plain, unhurried clarity of a man who has spent 3 years refusing to feel anything at all, that he had fallen in love with both of them. The reckoning came at the end of the month, when a hired rider from the county seat arrived with papers and a hard, official manner, sent by Naomi's late brother-in-law's kin, who had heard through the depot gossip that an orphaned infant was being raised out on the fen place by a woman with no legal claim to her, and meant to take the child east to be raised properly, by blood. She has no husband, no standing, and no paper naming her guardian, the rider said, laying the county's authority out plain on Grady's own kitchen table, while Naomi stood white-faced with Grace held so tight the baby began to fuss. "The child goes with me today, ma'am, by the judge's order, unless you can show cause the court will recognize." "She has cause," Grady said, and his voice filled the small kitchen the way thunder fills a canyon. "The child has a home, a name, and a family, mister, and you'll not take her out of it on a technicality of paper while I'm standing here to say otherwise." He crossed the room and put his hand over Naomi's, over the baby between them. "Naomi Wren is to be my wife, and this child will be raised under my name and my roof, with more law behind her than any court in this territory can argue with. If your judge wants to contest a rancher marrying a widow and claiming her kin as his own, he's welcome to ride out and say so to my face." The rider looked between them a long moment, at the rancher's hand steady over the widow's, at the baby's fist curled unknowing around Grady's shirt cuff, and seemed to understand there was no argument here that paper alone would win. He rode back to the county seat with nothing but Grady's word to carry, and Grady's word, as it happened, was good enough. No judge in that territory cared to ride out and test a man's claim on his own family in his own house. That evening, with the storm-scoured sky gone gold above Sparrow Creek and Grace finally, thoroughly asleep in the cradle Grady had built without ever quite admitting he was building it for her, he found Naomi on the porch, still trembling faintly from the day's fright. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "Marriage, to a writer from the county no less, before you'd said a word of it to me. I've been meaning to say it to you for 2 weeks and losing my nerve every time," he admitted, rough and honest in the way he'd learned, these last weeks, that she deserved. "I swore off children because I couldn't bear the ghost of the one I lost. I never thought to swear off you, Naomi, because I never thought a woman like you would walk up my drive with a basket of secrets and undo 3 years of grief in a single crooked-buttoned evening. I'm asking now plain, with no county rider standing over us to force the words. Will you have me? You and Grace and whatever else this house has been missing since the day it went quiet." She looked at him, this gruff, wounded man who had sworn off small voices and been undone by one anyway, who had stood in his own kitchen and claimed a stranger's child as blood rather than see her taken, and felt the last of her fear loosen into something warm and certain. "I will," she said, and let him draw her in against his chest, out on the porch where the storm had passed and the creek ran high and bright below them. "But you should know, Mr. Fenn, I've one more secret left to confess." "Which is?" "I never once creased those linens." And she laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and he laughed with her. And inside the house their daughter slept on, safe now under a name and a roof that would never again know the word "no children," only the sound, at long last, of one small child home.